Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I think what he meant to say when he said I was very good at keeping them on right track with thinking about worldview, that I was very argumentative, and I wouldn't take yes or no for an answer at times, but kept everyone on their toes, including myself. So I really appreciate being here, and happy Father's Day to the fathers in here and the fathers online. I'm really glad that my dad was able to bring that video with the jokes being told throughout the video about dads and things they say, because I got to tell you, I was really struggling to think of some kind of joke to open up this sermon. And the reason for that is usually you tell a joke to get everyone relaxed, attentive, and just to get a general sense of peace about what's to be said. But honestly, this whole year has been kind of one cruel joke, hasn't it? And what a time to be alive. I'm exhausted mentally, and that's merely from just trying to keep up with everything that's going on. And if I'm exhausted, can you even imagine what people who are in the medical field actually feel, or those who are first responders, those who are in politics, or just those who are scared and frightened about the epidemic or the social climate and how that's affecting them and their children. And this holiday in particular has come during an incredibly trying year, as I said. But as I expect most fathers will do, they will take it in stride as they've always done, pretending with a few jokes that everything is okay without receiving their due gratitude. So I just want to stop and say thank you. Thank you to fathers who have made it their business to be the rock of their families, those who offer encouragement to us, who challenge us to be better, and who stick by our side no matter what. And let's be honest with ourselves for a minute. Father's Day is a bit of a sham holiday. We know for a fact which parent holiday is celebrated most enthusiastically, don't we? And it's Mother's Day. And that's for good reason. I'm not saying that that's not right, but and it's a good reason because the obvious contribution mothers make to our emotional, spiritual, physical well-being all throughout our lives. And yet, why is it that Father's Day is the butt end of every joke in movies and television? And if you go to the next slide. The next one with one more. I don't know if any of you guys watch The Cosby Show, but this is the episode about Father's Day. This is him putting on all the different Father's Day gifts that he's received over the years. Different hat and tie. Oh, I don't know if you could. I'm very good at posting pictures that are grainy. I'm very good at that. But also, why is it that the most typical portrayal of fathers on screens are of buffoons, slobs, and lazy? And that's the next slide here. In an article from fatherhood.org, Christopher A. Brown relents that from Jim Anderson in Fathers Knows Best to Al Bundy in Married with Children, and Jay Pritchett from Modern Family, TV dads are usually portrayed as foolish, no matter what race or socioeconomic status is depicted. In my experience, I see writers who have set the bar so low for these men that when they do even one small compassionate thing, they're hailed as heroes in the story, often at the expense of mothers who in the same shows actually do all the work. That's not the kind of men that we see throughout history. And if you go to the next slide, Camilla Anna Paglia is an American feminist academic and social critic, as well as professor at the University of Arts in Philadelphia. She observes this about men all throughout history, that men have sacrificed and crippled themselves physically and emotionally to feed, house, and protect women and children. None of their pain or achievement is registered in feminist rhetoric, which portrays men as oppressive and callous exploiters. When the Titanic was sinking, under order from Captain Edward Smith, the crew was to give priority to women and children first when filling the lifeboats. And as a result, about 70% of the women and children on the Titanic survived, compared to less than 20% of the men. Children in shipwrecks often don't survive at all. When I see numbers like that, I'm heartbroken for the malign picture of fathers that we get from media entertainment and their interpretation of statistics. In this next slide, in an article from Psychology Today written by Dita Oliger, she reports how the changes in 20th century economy brought a diminished role to fatherhood, especially in the fathers, how fathers were understood as part of the family in general. She says, another factor in the diminished role of fathers was the then new field of psychology. In fact, psychology became part of the problem. Research studies did not place much importance on the role of the father, and his influence in the development and growth of his child was reported as insignificant. The term parent was often meant as mother, and father, if mentioned, was equivalent to other influences. Only a small number of parent-child studies investigated the father's role, and the few studies that were done at the time focused on the father's involvement as reported by the mother. An indirect result of the lack of research on data on fathers was the implied assumption that they weren't interested in fathering. She then goes on to talk about how there has been an almost complete 180 in psychology about the importance of the father in the family and child's development, highlighting how fathers help children become emotionally secure, be confident, and have better connections far into adulthood. So psychology no longer views the role as being equal to other social factors. But why should we care? So what? What about this applies to our spiritual walk with God? Obviously, each of us has a biological father. Some of us also have stepfathers, some have spiritual fathers. Some may have never had any kind of father figure at all in their life. In light of that, my goal here today is not to whine 25 minutes about the loss of traditional values. My goal is to get all of us, regardless of who we are, what part of life we're in, to understand how we as followers of Christ, children of God, are to be champions of the family unit, and by doing so, in light of this particular holiday, we take a second to honor our fathers. For those of us lucky enough to have someone that faithfully fulfills that role of fatherhood, I would also challenge you to be grateful to them as well as honor them. In my generation, there's been a recent trend, movies, television, culture, more broadly, and obviously in real life, to emotionally disown one's parents for their transgressions, to cut ties with them emotionally as an act of independence, to punish them with impunity without any regard for grace or understanding. And I have to say to this that I just cannot find any justification for this attitude in Scripture. Now, before I continue, let me get through some things that are let me get some things out of the way. When I say that, I am in no way condoning abuse. I would hope it's obvious, but if your children and you are in immediate physical danger, you should do what you must to ensure their and your safety. And two, in saying that, I can't find this attitude in Scripture. I'm not oblivious to the fact that this entire book was written during a patriarchal society where women were often mistreated, underrepresented, and devalued. But having said that, charity has to be given to the social context. What was the general attitudes and behaviors of that time, and how did God command his people to behave in light of those general attitudes and behaviors? For instance, if we took an equal rights advocate and suddenly transported them all the way back to ancient Israel, and that person found a young woman who wasn't married yet, and tried to explain to that woman that having a child was not important, that they should just start a business, get an education, and live a life free of social norms, that woman would be terribly confused, and so should we. Because in that time, if you didn't have children, you had no way of taking care of yourself in old age. You also had no way to take care of yourself if you got hurt. Thank God we're born in a time where we have that kind of infrastructure, where when we retire, we at least have the option to go into full-time care because we have the infrastructure that allows for that. Or, in another instance, if that equal rights advocate went to one of the men of those times before they were married, and instead of an agrarian profession like farming, they told them to pursue an academia profession, as I did. Well, sadly, that person would die of starvation even quicker than myself. Now, I've managed to stave off hunger a few years because my wife is able to get really great jobs. But that guy would stand no chance whatsoever. So my point is, I know the society was patriarchal, but we're looking for how people responded to experiences and extrapolate principles for our now vastly different culture. And do you know why we can do that? Because we're all humans. And we share something called the human experience: life, pain, happiness, and death. So I hope that clears some of the misunderstandings out of the way. But when I say that I can't find this attitude in the Bible, I'm meaning that there is never any room given by God or His commandments to treat parents with disrespect, disown, or treat them as if they have to earn your respect. In fact, those who were greatly disrespecting their parents were seen as rebels by the whole community and considered social outcasts. It's so serious, there was even room given in Leviticus to stone them. Did that actually happen? I don't think so. The command was mainly to show that the transgression was serious and that their punishment was in the hands of their parents. You'd have to be a really cruel parent to actually follow through with something like that. But this is a very different picture from the kind of family units we find in the world today. By and large, from the kids' coming-of-age movies we've been fed over the years, it's almost with great applause that one is shown to disrespect their parents. That the self is promoted over and above the family unit entirely. This subject is so serious that God designated it out as one of the 10 Commandments, the serious principles by which we live as Christians. In Exodus 20:12, I'm sure you're all familiar with the 10 Commandments. It says, "Honor your father and your mother so that they may live long in the land the Lord God is giving you." In a commentary that I used for this, the UBS Handbook Commentary to Exodus, the short little excerpt it has on that is, "Honor your father and mother means more than simply to obey your parents." This commandment was addressed primarily to adults, and the word honor means to give weight or dignity to, in the sense of respect. I'm embarrassed for my theological tradition, mainly in academia, for how little they've developed and advocated for the practice of honoring fathers. Based on what God is saying here in this one commandment, if we're not honoring parents the same, then we're not upholding this commandment. There's a good moment to pause and ask yourself that, have I honored my father in the same way that I've honored my mother? And there are just no resources for this in the modern time. As much as I want to make informed statements thoroughly backed up by different theologians on fathers, I just simply can't, because it is so scant in early theology and it is visually absent today. So I'm going to speculate here, but I'm going to try to do so with as much biblical principle as I can. Part of the reason I suspect it's so hard for us to uphold our fathers, honor them, gratify them, aside from all the psychological factors and socioeconomic factors that I just can't speak to, is because we have failed to uphold, honor, and gratify God as our Father. It's no accident that God ordained who He did as your father or fathers, if you have multiple father figures. It's not supposed to be easy, but it is through the honoring of parents equally, even in the face of adversity, that we come to know God's heart. Fathers throughout the Bible have shared a really unique kind of relationship with God. And we'll look at a couple figures here. If you go to the next slide, first we have, one more. First we have Adam. Ignore the ethnicity of Adam and God, because I highly doubt Adam was Caucasian. But aside from that, Adam, the father of Cain of Abel, the first man, was not only a father in his own right, but also a spiritual representative father for the entire human race. He literally carried the fate of the world on his shoulders. And what did Adam do? He ate of the apple. He partook of something that was in direct violation of God's law. And since he knew God more intimately than even we do, because he literally walked with Him in the gardens, this was an incredibly serious offense that stained him and the rest of humanity with guilt forever until the Messiah was to come. That's a great example of a father, huh? But what do we learn from Adam in his failures that we take today? In general, we learn very intimately about the weight of failure. It's heavy and it's costly. Not only did Adam suffer from his own guilt, but he was further tormented by the first murder of his son by his other son. And yet, despite the weight of his failures, he still felt obligated to teach his sons about and to worship God. If he had not, humanity would not have really any connection with God, and all would have been for nothing. We also learn from Adam very soberly that ultimately a father is first and foremost accountable to God himself. There was no law at the time other than the divine law set from God's own holiness. There was nowhere to hide from his transgressions, no lawyer to draw up some syllogistic argument. His example is the clearest that all people, especially fathers in the literal sense, are accountable to God. And I'm going to skip a lot of the biblical characters in history, mostly because I just don't want to keep you here all day. But the next picture here is of Moses. So Moses stood as both a father in his own right as well, to two sons, as well as the representative father of Israel. He led Israel out of Egypt, captivity, and the brutal rule of the Pharaoh, and towards God's promised land for them. Moses played another key role that goes further than even the typical father. He also stood as mediator between Israel and destruction. When Israel, on their way to the promised land, gave up on God, they gave themselves over to idol worship and all kinds of evil and unrighteous behavior, God was set to wipe them out and start anew through Moses. But Moses stood in their place, appealing to God's mercy that he spare them, otherwise he, Moses, should perish with them. God responded to Moses' heartfelt compassion by keeping his covenant with Israel despite their shameful obedience. So Moses stands as intercessory father to his people, appealing to God's merciful and loving nature to protect them, preserve them, and grow them in their faith. Fathers in today's culture and in God's kingdom are meant to be in a similar kind of role, praying and intercessing for their own families. And finally, I want to talk about Saul, and that's in the next picture as well. Right from the outset, you can tell he's a great father, right? But Saul was the first king of Israel, ordained by God himself, and who stood as a major father figure in David's life. You remember David as the guy who slew Goliath, and who was known as a man after God's own heart all throughout his life as king of Israel. Quickly, though, I'll give you just a brief rundown of their kind of relationship. Saul was ordained as king. He defied God, so God took Saul's right to rule away and chose David to one day rule, even though David was a child. Saul at first loved David after the events of him slaying Goliath, even inviting David to become part of his house. But he quickly became jealous when he thought David was trying to take his throne. So he tried to have David killed many times. This is one of them. Threw a couple spears at him. David every time exercised patience, understanding, and appealed to Saul over and over that he loved him and would never hurt him. This tumultuous relationship came to a head when David, who was on the run as a fugitive, stumbled upon Saul resting outside of a cave where David was hiding. He had every ample opportunity here to end Saul's life, but he didn't. And furthermore, he couldn't. David saw Saul, that's kind of a tongue twister, David saw Saul as being divinely ordained over Israel. And further than that, I think he thought of Saul as his father. If ever there was a time in history where vengeance could be wrought upon one's parents, where it would have been justified, it would look like it was here. David had all the cards in his favor. God had chosen him to be king over Saul. Saul tried to kill him multiple times already, and ending Saul's life here would have prevented catastrophic harm to his fellow Israelites who would eventually go to war over their rivalry. But he couldn't, because upholding Saul's honor was a command laid down by God. Whatever Saul's transgressions, he could not sin against him in that way. Fathers, in the way we saw from Moses and Adam, carry the weight of their families upon their shoulders. Even in a changing world where traditional roles have been swapped, where men nurture children while the wife can work, we must return to the importance of fathers in families. We must begin to ask ourselves about why it is we've failed to uphold the honor of our fathers, given the fact that God used fathers to move history and advance his plan for salvation. These were deeply imperfect men that honored God. But despite suffering under their own failures, they continued to be faithful to God and took their suffering in stride. And I want to invite the worship team back up. But now, I don't want you to take this today as some kind of effort to argue for the support of fathers regardless of their failings. My hope was to present in more of a rhetorical manner, to get us to ponder what fathers have meant to us, what we are called to do by God in honoring them, and how we can begin to change how we perceive them in our culture. Fathers lack the immediate biological connection that mothers have with children from birth. Fathers must work to procure and nurture a relationship with their children, their wife, and to be a firm foundation that grounds values for their family, as well as protect them. Unfortunately, a striking number, a huge number of fathers have chosen for one reason or another, to not accept that responsibility, abandoning their families emotionally or physically. But does that give us the right to malign them, to make sure they suffer every ounce of pain that they've caused in our own lives? Well, I invite you to think that if you think you can do a better job holding them accountable than God can, then go right ahead. Fathers are accountable to God. As such, their placement in that role is not for us to decide whether they deserve it or not. Our responsibility is to somehow come to a place where we can reasonably disagree, absolve our bitterness, and extend grace even where it's not deserved.